My sister was standing on the front porch when the car pulled into the driveway. I saw her before she saw me. She had her arms crossed, phone in one hand, that particular look on her face. Not worried, just impatient, like she'd been waiting for something that was taking too long. I was still in the discharge gown under my coat. The hospital had given me a thin paper bag with my clothes inside, but I hadn't changed. I hadn't had the energy. I'd just signed the papers, nodded at the nurse, and walked out through the sliding doors into the gray afternoon air. That was 40 minutes ago. The man who drove me home, I'll get to him, parked slowly. He didn't rush. He turned off the engine and just sat there for a moment before I moved to get out. And my sister looked at me, really looked, up and down. Then she said, "You look fine to me. Mom needs you to cook." I didn't answer her. I just stepped to the side so she could see who was sitting in the driver's seat. Her whole face changed, not in a way that made sense to me yet, it changed. Her arms dropped, her mouth opened slightly, and she said in a voice that was almost a whisper, "Why is he in our driveway?" She wasn't asking me. She was asking herself, and I didn't know what that meant. Not yet, but I filed it away. Because I'd learned a long time ago that the things my family didn't want to explain were usually the things most worth understanding. Let me go back, because none of this makes sense without the part that came before it. My name is Lena. I'm 33 years old. I'm the middle child in a family of 3, and for most of my adult life, that middle position translated into something very specific. I was the one who stayed. Not because I had fewer options than my sister Carla or my brother Marcus. I had the same options. I just had a different kind of conditioning. When I was 12, my mother told me, "You have a gift for taking care of people." She said it the way a person says something that's meant to sound like a compliment but is actually an instruction. And I carried it. For 20 years, I carried it. I lived about 15 minutes from my parents' house. Not because I couldn't afford to move further. Because my mother asked me not to. She said it with her eyes more than her words. She said it by calling me when her back hurt, when the insurance paperwork was confusing, when she needed someone to sit with her at a doctor's appointment, and my sister was busy and my brother didn't understand those things. I was the one who understood those things. I worked remotely as an operations manager for a mid-sized consulting firm. The flexibility was real, but it was also how I justified always being available. I thought I was choosing it freely. That's the thing about patterns you've been trained into. They feel like choices because no one is holding a gun to you. They just hold something else, something quieter, something you've been taught to call love. For the 2 years before my hospitalization, things had shifted in ways I kept explaining away. My father had passed. That was the first shift. He died 18 months before this story begins. And what followed was not the grief I expected from my family. It was reorganization. Quiet, fast, strategic reorganization. My mother moved into a smaller bedroom. The main bedroom was being, quote, renovated. Documents came out of filing cabinets. There were phone calls I walked into, and then was asked to leave. My brother flew in from Houston for a long weekend, and then flew back without really telling me what the visit was about. My sister started asking me casually, not urgently, just casually, whether I'd ever thought about getting my own place somewhere farther out. I didn't think much of any of it individually. That's how it works, I think. Each piece is small enough to explain away, but the pattern, I should have seen the pattern earlier. What I saw instead was more work, more need. My mother's blood pressure was up. She needed someone to coordinate with her cardiologist, track her medication schedule, manage the grocery delivery, deal with the lawn service after my father's company stopped honoring the contract. I stepped into all of it. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself this was what family did. 6 months in, I was waking up at 5:30 every morning with a heaviness in my chest that I assumed was anxiety. I'd had anxiety before. I knew what it felt like. This felt like that, but heavier, like something sitting on me. I stopped sleeping through the night. I started losing weight without meaning to. I got migraines that lasted 3 days. I called my doctor and she said to come in, but I kept rescheduling because there was always something at my mother's house that needed handling first. My mother's follow-up, Carla borrowing my car for 2 weeks because hers was in the shop, a situation with Marcus involving a bank account that I won't get into yet, but that I found out about in pieces over the course of 4 months, and that, looking back now, was the first real thread of what would eventually unravel everything. The collapse, when it came, was not dramatic. I was sitting at my kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in October, drafting an email for work. I noticed my hands were shaking. I noticed the shaking wasn't stopping. I noticed I couldn't remember if I had eaten anything in the last 24 hours. And when I tried to stand up to go to the kitchen, the room tilted in a way that didn't correct itself. I sat back down. I called my mother first. Habit. The phone rang 4 times and she picked up and I said, "I don't feel well. I think something is wrong." And she said, "Can it wait? Carla is here and we're in the middle of something." I said, "Okay." I hung up. I called my doctor's office. They told me to go to the emergency room. I drove myself. I sat in the ER for 6 hours. They admitted me. Stress-induced cardiac event, not a heart attack. They were clear about that, but the kind of thing that becomes a heart attack if you ignore it long enough. Severe dehydration, exhaustion. My cortisol levels were, as one nurse put it, remarkable for someone who hadn't been in active combat. My mother came to the hospital once. On the second day, she sat for 45 minutes, asked about the parking situation, mentioned that the house needed some things dealt with, and left. Carla texted me twice, both times asking about where I kept the key to the storage unit and whether I had the login for the utilities account. Marcus called once on day 4 from a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, he said, "Hey, are you out yet? I need to talk to you about something." When I said I wasn't out yet, he said, "Okay, call me when you're home," and hung up. No one asked how I was doing, not directly, not in a way that waited for the real answer. I was in the hospital for 5 days. On the 5th day, a social worker came to my room. Standard protocol for cardiac admissions involving stress, she explained. She sat across from me in the chair my mother had sat in, and she asked me what my home situation was like. And I said, "Fine," because that's what I always said. And she nodded in a way that made me feel like she'd heard that word 100 times and knew exactly what it covered. She gave me a pamphlet. She also mentioned, very gently, that during my intake process, something had come up with my insurance information that had been flagged for a secondary review. She didn't know the details. Someone from the billing department had already been in contact with someone on my behalf, she said. She said it like it was normal. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't find out what it meant until the morning I was discharged. There was a man waiting in the lobby. I didn't know him. He was standing near the information desk with his jacket on, holding a cup of coffee, looking at his phone, the way people look at their phones, when they're actually just waiting and need something to do with their hands. He was older than me, somewhere in his mid-40s, calm the way people are calm when they've learned it rather than inherited it. When I came through the elevator doors with my paper bag of clothes and my discharge paperwork, he looked up. He said my name. He said it the way people say names when they're confirming something, not discovering it, like he already knew. I said, "Yes." He introduced himself as Derek Hale. He said he worked in estate and probate law and that he had been trying to reach me for several weeks through what he called irregular channels because his more direct attempts had not gone through. He said that was a longer conversation for another time. He said that for now he had come to offer me a ride home, and that there were some things he thought I should understand before I walked back into my house. I should have asked more questions right there in the lobby, I know that, but I was tired in the kind of way that makes decisions feel very simple. And something about the way he stood there, unhurried, precise, not trying to sell me anything, made me feel for the first time in 5 days like someone had come to the hospital with something other than a request. So I got in the car. The drive was quiet for the first few minutes. He didn't push. He asked if I needed to stop anywhere. I said no. He asked if I had eaten. I said I had, at the hospital, which was mostly true. Then about 10 minutes in, he said, "Can I ask you something about your father's estate?" And something shifted behind my sternum. Not fear exactly, more like recognition, like a door I hadn't known existed had just been pointed out to me. I said, "What about it?" He said, "When did you last see the will?" I told him I hadn't. I told him my mother had handled everything after the funeral. I told him there was a family attorney, someone my parents had used for years, and that I had assumed everything was being managed. I told him I hadn't asked because it hadn't seemed like something I needed to ask about. He was quiet for a moment after that. Then he said, "That's what I was concerned about." He didn't explain what he meant. We drove the rest of the way in silence, and I watched the road and tried to understand what I was feeling. Not panic, not anger, just a very specific, very cold kind of alertness, like something I had been half asleep to, had just made a sound in the dark, and I wasn't sure yet if I had actually heard it or imagined it. And then we pulled into the driveway, and Carla was on the porch, and she looked at me, and she told me I looked fine, and she told me Mom needed me to cook, and I stepped aside, and she saw Derek, and she said his name, not out loud, but her lips moved, the way they do when something surprises you into silence, when your brain says the word before your voice can stop it. She had said, "Why is he in our driveway?" But what I heard, underneath that, what I heard in the particular frequency of her voice, was something else entirely. She wasn't surprised he existed. She was surprised he was here, and those are two very different things. I stood on that porch for a moment longer than I needed to. Carla had already recovered her expression. By the time I looked back at her, the shock was gone, smoothed over into something that looked like mild irritation. She was good at that. She had always been good at that. The quick reset. The face that said nothing happened here. There is nothing to look at. Move along. But I had seen it. I had seen the half second before the reset, and I had heard her say his name without saying it. Derek was still in the car. He hadn't moved to get out. He was looking at his phone again, that same patient stillness from the hospital lobby, like he had all the time in the world and no need to announce himself. I found that strange in the moment. I find it less strange now. Carla looked at me. "Are you coming inside or what?" I said, "Give me a minute." She made a sound that wasn't quite a word and went back through the front door. I walked back to the car. I knocked lightly on the passenger window and he rolled it down. I said, "She recognized you." He didn't look surprised that I'd noticed. He said, "Yes, I imagine she did." I said, "How?" He said, "That's part of what we need to talk about. Not here, though. Not today. You just got out of the hospital. Go inside. Get some rest. I'll be in touch tomorrow with some paperwork I think you'll want to look at." I said, "What kind of paperwork?" He said, "The kind that answers the question you haven't known how to ask yet." He said it without drama. He wasn't trying to be cryptic. He was being careful. I could feel the difference, though I couldn't have explained it then. He handed me a card through the window. Plain white. His name, a phone number, and the name of a firm I didn't recognize. I watched him back out of the driveway. Then I stood on the path to the front door for a long moment, holding his card, trying to decide something I couldn't quite name. Inside, the house was the way it always was. Warm, slightly cluttered, smelling like the candle my mother kept burning on the kitchen counter, regardless of the time of year. My mother was in her chair in the living room, feet up, television on low. She looked over when I came in. She said, "You're back. How do you feel?" I said, "Tired." She said, "Sit down for a minute. Then when you're ready, there's chicken in the fridge." Carla was going to do it, but she doesn't do it the right way. I stood in the doorway between the hall and the living room, and I looked at my mother, not with anger, not yet, just looking, trying to see her the way Derek's question had rearranged something behind my eyes. She was 61. She'd had a hard life in ways I genuinely respected. She had worked, she had sacrificed, she had held things together in ways that were real. I had never questioned that. But somewhere along the line, the holding together had become something else. Or maybe it had always been something else, and I had called it strength because the alternative understanding was too uncomfortable to sit with. I said, "Mom, when Dad passed, the estate, was everything handled through Richard's office?" Richard was their attorney, had been their attorney for 15 years. My mother looked at me for a beat too long before she answered. Just a beat, just enough. She said, "Of course. Why would you ask that?" I said, "I just never saw anything. I never saw any documents." She said, "And Lena, you were grieving. We all were. I handled it because that's what needed to happen. Why are you making this a problem?" There it was, that exact phrase, "Why are you making this a problem?" I had heard it my whole life. It was her way of reversing the direction of a question. Suddenly, I wasn't asking a reasonable thing. I was doing something to her. I was creating difficulty where there was none. I said, "I'm not making it a problem. I'm just asking." She said, "You just got out of the hospital. You should rest, not stress yourself with paperwork questions." She turned back to the television. Conversation over. That was how she did it. Not with a fight. With a wall. I went to the kitchen. Carla was at the table on her phone. She didn't look up when I came in. I went to the fridge and stood there with the door open, not really seeing what was inside. I said, "How do you know Derek Hale?" The silence that followed was exactly 1 second too long. Carla said, "Who?" I said, "The man who drove me home. You recognized him." "How?" She put her phone face down on the table. That small gesture. Face down. I noticed it. She said, "I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't recognize him. I just thought it was weird that you got in a car with some random person from the hospital." I said, "You said his name." She said, "I said, why is he here? I didn't say any name." I looked at her for a long moment. She held my gaze, and to her credit, she held it steadily. Carla had always been a better liar than Marcus. Marcus got flustered, over-explained, gave you more information than the question required. Carla just went flat. She had this ability to drain all expression from her face and wait you out. I let it go, not because I believed her, because I understood, in that moment, that pressing further would only make her more careful. And I needed her to be less careful, not more. I took the chicken out of the fridge. I cooked. I know how that sounds. I know what you're thinking. And I thought it too, in a quieter part of my mind, while my hands did the familiar work and the kitchen filled with familiar smells and the television murmured in the next room. But here's what I understood about myself in that moment, which I had never understood so clearly before. I wasn't cooking because they asked. I wasn't cooking because I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't. I was cooking because I needed to think, and I had always thought better when my hands were busy, and I needed to think about Derek Hale. Who was he? How did he find me at the hospital? How did he know my name without introduction? How did he know to come that morning on that specific day at the hour of my discharge? How did Carla know him? And what did it mean that she was pretending not to? He had asked about my father's will. He had said that's what I was concerned about. I turned that sentence over and over while I cooked. Marcus called during dinner. My mother answered, spoke to him for a few minutes in a low voice with her back half turned, then hung up and said he was thinking of coming through next weekend. She said it casually, helping herself to more food, but she'd moved to the other room to take the call. She came back to the table and picked up her fork and said nothing else about it. Carla ate without talking. She was still on her phone, which my mother didn't comment on, which she would have commented on if I'd done it. I ate and said nothing and watched them. After dinner, I said I was tired and that I was going to go home. My mother said, "Stay here tonight. You shouldn't be alone." She had never once said that to me in 5 days of hospitalization. I said, "I'm fine. I need my own bed." She said, "You're always running off." I wasn't running off. I had just spent 5 days alone in a hospital room, but I said nothing. I took my coat and my paper bag, and I got in my own car, which had been driven back from the hospital by someone. I still don't know who. It was just there when I arrived. And I drove home. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd been sitting when my hands started shaking 2 weeks before. I put Derek's card in front of me. I looked at the name of the firm, Hale and Associates, estate litigation, not estate planning, not estate management, litigation. I didn't sleep much. I spent a portion of the night going through things I had filed away over the past 18 months without fully examining, emails from my mother that I'd responded to without questioning, a text from Marcus 7 months ago asking whether my name was on any of Dad's accounts, which I'd answered honestly. No, just the joint checking, and that had been closed and settled. And then never thought about again. A conversation with Carla at Christmas where she had asked very offhandedly whether I'd ever considered renting out my place. I'd thought she was suggesting I travel more, take care of myself. I'd thought it was almost considerate. I started to wonder if it had been. I called Derek the next morning at 8:30. He answered on the second ring. I said, "You said you'd send paperwork today." He said, "Yes, I'll need you to confirm a secure email, and I need to ask, do you have any documents related to your father's estate at your home? Anything at all?" I thought about it. My father had given me a folder once, maybe 3 years before he passed, with some personal paperwork in it, account numbers, some letters, things he said I should hold on to. I had put it in the cabinet above my closet and not touched it since. I said, "Maybe, I'm not sure what's in it." He said, "Before you open anything, I want you to have some context. Can you come to my office this afternoon?" I said yes. He gave me an address. He said, "Come alone. Don't mention it to anyone in your family. I know that might feel unusual. I want to explain why I'm asking that." I said, "You can explain it now." He paused. Then he said, "Because there is at least one person in your family who already knows I've been looking into this, and until you understand the full picture, I'd like to keep the circle small." One person. I thought of Carla's face on the porch, her lips moving around his name before she could stop them. I thought of my mother moving to the other room to take Marcus's call. I said, "Okay," he said, "there's one more thing I need to tell you before you come in. It may be difficult to hear." I said, "Tell me." He said, "The will your father made was updated 8 months before he passed. The version your family processed through probate, the one Richard filed, was not the most recent version. I have the most recent version, and your name appears in it differently than it does in the version that was filed." The kitchen was very quiet. I could hear the refrigerator hum. I could hear my own breathing. I said, "Differently how?" He said, "More significantly." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "Who knew about the updated version?" He said, "That's exactly the right question, and I think you already suspect the answer." He was right. I did suspect it, and the suspicion sat in my chest like something that had been there for a long time, waiting for the right word to give it shape. I had 3 hours before his office. I spent the first hour sitting very still at my kitchen table. I spent the second going through the folder my father had given me above the closet. I had forgotten most of what was in it. There were account statements, old ones, from a savings account I hadn't known existed. There was a letter in my father's handwriting, not sealed, not addressed, just folded, that began with my name and then said several things I'm not ready to write about yet, not in this part of the story. And there was something else at the bottom of the folder, a business card, Hale and Associates. My father's handwriting on the back of it, 7 digits, a date from 2 years ago. My father had Derek Hale's number, had written it down, had kept it in a folder he gave to me specifically. I turned the card over in my hands, and I understood that whatever was coming had not begun at the hospital, had not begun at the reading of a will I was never invited to, had not begun with a man waiting in a lobby with a cup of coffee. It had begun with my father, deliberately, quietly. He had placed something in my hands 2 years ago, and I had put it in a cabinet and walked back downstairs to make dinner for a family that had been, even then, building something around me that I couldn't see. I put the card in my pocket, I put on my coat, and I did something I don't think I had done in longer than I could honestly remember. I left the house without telling anyone where I was going. Derek's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown that looked like it had been there for 50 years and intended to stay for 50 more. No glass facade, no trendy signage, just a brass plate beside the door with the firm name on it, polished but not new. The kind of office that doesn't need to impress you because it has never needed to. His assistant offered me water and I took it. I sat in a chair across from a desk covered in neat stacks of documents and I waited. I was surprisingly calm. I had expected to feel more. But there is a particular stillness that comes when you have been anxious for a very long time, And then something finally confirms what you already knew. It doesn't feel like relief, exactly. It feels like the moment after a held breath. Derek came in, sat down, opened a folder. He didn't ease into it. He said, "Your father updated his will 14 months before he passed. The update was drafted here, signed here, witnessed here, and filed with the court. It is a valid legal document. The version that was submitted through probate by Richard Calloway, your family's attorney, was the prior version, dated 3 years earlier." I said, "How is that possible?" He said, "Richard Calloway and your mother have had a personal relationship for a number of years. I'm not going to characterize it beyond that because it isn't relevant to the legal matter. What is relevant is that he submitted an outdated document to probate court, and there is sufficient evidence to suggest that was not an oversight." I looked at the folder in front of him. I said, "What does the updated version say?" He turned it around and slid it across the desk. I read it slowly. My father had divided his estate into 3 equal parts. One for my mother, to be held in trust with specific conditions around the family home. One for a small charitable fund he had set up quietly, something I had never heard of. And 1/3 of everything, directly to me. Not to the family, not to be distributed at my mother's discretion. To me, by name. With a note in the margin in my father's handwriting that said simply, "For everything she has carried." I put the document down on the desk. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that. I thought I might, but what I felt wasn't grief exactly, or even anger. It was something older than both of those. It was the feeling of being seen by someone who was no longer there to see you. My father had known. He had watched. And he had understood, and he had tried to protect me in the only language that would survive him. And someone had intercepted that language before it reached me. Derek said, "The estate had significant assets, the family home, 2 investment accounts, and a property your father purchased in 2019 that no one mentioned to you." I said, "A property." He said, "A house, about 40 minutes north. It was meant to be yours. It's currently being rented out. The income has been deposited into an account your mother controls." For 18 months, while I drove 15 minutes to cook dinner and manage medications and reschedule my own doctor's appointments, while I collapsed at my kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with shaking hands, while I sat alone in a hospital room for 5 days and received 2 texts asking about a storage unit key. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I said, "What happens now?" Derek said, "That depends on what you want. You have standing to contest the probate filing. Given what we have, the outcome is not uncertain. Richard Calloway is already under a separate inquiry. I can't go into detail on that. Your family will be notified formally within the next 10 days, regardless of what you decide. But the decisions about how you proceed, what you claim, and how much contact you want to have with your family during this process, those are entirely yours." He said it plainly, no pressure in either direction. I appreciated that more than I could say. I won't walk through every legal detail of what followed, partly because it took 8 months and the procedural parts are not the point, partly because the point was never really about the money, even though the money mattered, even though what was taken was real and what was owed was real. The point was something that happened about 3 weeks after I sat in Derek's office. My mother called me. I had not seen her since the night I went home from the hospital. I had kept distance on Derek's advice and my own instinct. She had called several times. I had responded briefly, said I was resting, said I would come by soon. I had not come by. This call was different. She said, "I need you to come over. We need to talk as a family." I said, "About what?" She said, "You know about what. Lena, this is being blown completely out of proportion. Whatever that man told you, there are things you don't understand about the situation. Your father and I made decisions together. That's how a marriage works." I said, "Did he decide together with you to change his will 14 months before he died?" Silence. Then she said, "He wasn't well. He wasn't thinking clearly. I was protecting the family." And there it was, not a denial, not an explanation, a justification. She had moved past the question of whether it happened and gone straight to the reason it was acceptable. That told me everything about how long she had been sitting with this, how settled she was in her version of events, how certain she had been that I would never find out, or, if I did, would never push back. I said, "Mom, I'm not going to argue with you about this." She said, "Lena, don't make this a problem. This is a family thing. We can work it out without lawyers." And I thought about how many times I had stepped back when she said that, how many times that phrase had functioned as a door closing in my face and I had thanked her for it, how many times I had translated "we can work it out" to mean she would decide and I would accept. I said, "I'll talk to you when there's something to talk about." And I hung up. That was the confrontation. I know it sounds small. I know it doesn't have the shape of what people usually imagine when they think about a reckoning. No raised voices, no table of evidence, no moment where she crumbled and admitted everything while I stood over her with righteous calm. It was just a phone call I ended on my terms. But I had never done that before. I had never once ended a call with my mother on my own terms. It felt, in its quiet way, enormous. Marcus reached out 2 weeks later. He was more honest than I expected. He said he had known something was off with the estate. He said he hadn't asked questions because he benefited from the arrangement and he told himself it wasn't his business. He said he was sorry. He said it in a way that sounded true, even if it was incomplete. I didn't forgive him that day. I told him I heard him and that I needed time. He said, "Okay." That was as much as either of us had for each other in that moment, and I think we both understood it was more than nothing. Carla never reached out. I wasn't surprised. Carla had recognized Derek on that porch because she had seen his name, or maybe his face, somewhere in the architecture of what my mother had been managing. She had known enough to be afraid. And people like Carla, when they're afraid, don't reach toward the thing that frightens them. They go flat. They go quiet. They wait and hope the problem resolves itself. The problem didn't resolve itself. The probate contest was settled. I won't use that word like it was triumphant because it wasn't. Settlements rarely are. But the outcome was fair. The property my father had intended for me was transferred to my name. The rental income that had been collected was addressed. The family home remained for my mother with conditions that protected her but removed certain controls. Richard Calloway surrendered his license. That happened separately, and I had very little to do with it. I moved into the house 40 minutes north on a Thursday in March. It was empty when I arrived, just rooms and light and the sound of wind through old windows that needed new ceiling. I stood in the living room with a box of kitchen things in my arms, and I looked around at 4 walls that were mine, entirely mine, not borrowed from proximity or obligation or someone else's need. My father had bought this house. He had never told me. I don't know why he didn't. Maybe he was waiting for the right time. Maybe he was still working up to a conversation that would require him to admit out loud that he saw what was happening to me and had not known how to stop it while he was living. Maybe the will was the only way he knew to say, "I see you. I'm sorry. Here." I put the box down. I sat on the floor in the empty living room, and I let it out. All of it. Everything I had held together through the hospital and the porch and Derek's office and the phone call with my mother and the 8 months of legal process. I sat on that floor and I let myself feel the full weight of what had happened to me and what had almost happened and what my father had tried to prevent. I cried for a while. Then I got up. I unpacked the kitchen. Here is what I know now that I wish I had known at 23 or 28 or even 30. Being needed is not the same as being loved. I confused those two things for most of my adult life. I thought that being indispensable was a form of belonging. I thought that if I made myself essential enough, necessary enough, available enough, I would earn a place in my family that couldn't be taken from me. But that's not how it works. And if you've lived a version of this story, if you know what it feels like to be the one who stays, the one who handles things, the one who is first called and last considered, then you already understand what I'm saying. You've felt it, that particular exhaustion, that loneliness that doesn't have a clean name because it lives inside a relationship that is supposed to be the opposite of loneliness. You were not too sensitive. You were not too demanding. You were not making it a problem. You were paying attention. And the people who told you to stop paying attention were usually the ones with a reason to want you distracted. The second thing I know is this: rest is not weakness. I spent years treating my own depletion as a logistical inconvenience, something to push through, manage around, apologize for. My body finally made the argument I had refused to make for myself. In a hospital room on a Tuesday in October, I would not recommend waiting for your body to make the argument. If you are tired, in the way I was tired, not sleepy, but deeply, structurally tired, the kind of tired that lives in your bones and doesn't lift after a good night rest, that tiredness is information. It is your life telling you something. Listen to it before it has to repeat itself in a language you can't ignore. The third thing: some people will not change. Not because they can't, but because change would require them to acknowledge something they have decided never to acknowledge. You cannot argue someone into that acknowledgement. You cannot love them into it. You cannot exhaust yourself into it. All you can do is stop arranging your life around the hope that someday they will see you clearly. Some people never will. And you can survive that. You can build a life that doesn't require their seeing. I've been in this house for 7 months now. The windows are sealed. I planted something in the back, and I don't know enough about gardening to tell you what. I just bought things that looked like they wanted to grow and put them in the ground, and most of them did. I work from the room at the top of the stairs with the good light. I talk to Marcus sometimes, carefully, with appropriate distance, but genuinely. I think we are both trying to figure out who we are to each other now that the structure that defined us has been reorganized. It's slow. Most real things are. I don't talk to Carla. I don't talk to my mother much. We are in a kind of careful ceasefire. She is provided for. I am no longer the mechanism of her provision. I think she is angrier about the second part than she expected to be, and I think some mornings she looks at that anger and almost understands it for what it is. I hope one day she does. I don't need her to. That's the difference. That's the whole difference, and it took me 33 years in a hospital bed and a man waiting in a lobby with a cup of coffee to understand it. I don't need her to see me anymore. I already know what I'm worth, my father told me. He just had to wait until after he was gone to make sure the message got through. If this story felt familiar to you, I want to ask you something. Not about your family, not about the specific thing that was taken or withheld or minimized or explained away. I want to ask about the folder, because most of us have one, something set aside, something we haven't opened, because opening it would require us to look at the pattern, and looking at the pattern would require us to stop explaining it away. Open the folder. Whatever is in it, you are ready for it. And if you've been the one who stayed, the one who carried, the one who kept showing up long after the showing up stopped being returned, leave a comment below. Tell me what you've been carrying. Tell me what you're ready to put down. I read every single one. And if this story reached something in you, share it. Because somewhere right now there is someone sitting at a kitchen table with shaking hands who hasn't called the doctor yet, who keeps rescheduling, who keeps saying they'll deal with it after everything else is handled. Let this be the thing that reaches them. I'll see you in the next one.